and via your smart speaker.
Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio with Audi.
It is good to have you with us on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in very good company. Tonight, that is Kate McCann, our own political editor, who's here with me. Hello, Kate.
Hello.
Say hello. We've been talking all afternoon. George Parker is here now, political editor at the Financial Times. Hello, George.
Hi there, John.
Welcome, George. Let me ask you first then, what's your thought for the day?
Well, I'm down in Bournemouth, John and Kate, down at the Liberal Democrat conference. We're operating in a press room, which is like a giant aircraft hangar with relatively few journalists down here. But so we have to get our fun where we can. And so there were two things that happened. You've probably seen the pictures of Ed Davey falling into the sea off a kayak, which made it into a few papers. In fact, I think the Sun said it was the only coverage the Lib Dems were going to get from this conference, from him floundering around in the water. And then more seriously, there was an interesting debate in the conference today about the Liberal Democrat, or Ed Davey's plan to drop a housing target from their commitment. They were currently pledged to build 380,000 homes a year. That was deemed to be a bit too scary for target Tory voters they're trying to win over in seats, particularly in the south of England. So Ed Davey wanted to remove that, replace it with a target of building 150,000 social homes a year. And he was routed on the floor by young Liberals who were sporting T-shirts saying, just build bloody houses. So it's quite interesting, actually. It's unusual. Usually these conferences are quite stage managed, as you know.
Yeah.
On this occasion, he was turned over by his own party.
Well, not too many Lib Dem conferences are stage managed. They like to try, don't they? But you can't control that lot. It's one of the reasons why you can't help loving them. Okay.
You can't control the Lib
Dems.
Dems.
For the day?
It's actually similar to George's, but in the sense that I think what that Lib Dem moment showed us is that there is a real question now about long-term decision-making in politics. And even the Liberal Democrats, who often are sort of slightly better at this in that they don't necessarily have very much chance of being the governing party. So they have a bit more luxury in terms of long-term policies. You know, even they are trying to, some of them, scrap housing targets, long-term housing targets. We've been talking all day about, you know, investment in the railways, HS2, long-term difficult decisions. And even though Rishi Sunak stood up in number 9 Downing Street last week and promised to do just that, I'm not convinced that that is really where our politics is. And I suppose it's a variation on a thought that I have quite a lot of Mondays now, it feels, that politics is too short term and it doesn't necessarily serve everybody's interest in the way that it should. And I would like something to be done about that.
Something should be done. Let's write a letter to the Times. Something should be done. I mean, it's a good thought, which brings us, I guess, why don't we talk about HS2 now, because that's the topic of the moment. Now, you'd think it really ought to be within the capacity of a country like ours, a major economy, still, for all the talk of broken Britain, the birthplace of railway travel, apart from anything else, to build a railway network capable of doing what just about every other major economy has done already and carry us between our major cities and regions quickly. Don't you think? Well, turns out the task is beyond us, at least accomplishing it anywhere close to budget and without chopping and changing the plan countless times in a desperate effort to make it affordable. So now the dilemma inside government seems to be whether to press on, to throw more money into the furnace on Rishi Sunak's footplate in the hope that we get to the destination in the end and it'll all seem worth it, or to cut our losses, to admit defeat and spend money on this and that rail route, especially in the north of England where the sense of grievance and abandonment is at its most acute, and hope that people stop talking about HS2 eventually. Hope it becomes yesterday's story, yesterday's big idea. But the agonising, the wasted billions, they won't be forgotten quickly. High-speed rail may or may not be coming to a screeching halt. The row about it all is already running out of control, a political runaway complete halt, while the budget just keeps on growing and rolling along like a runaway train. And thanks to Soul Asylum for the commentary on that bit of politics. I'm going to ask you first, George. Stick your neck out a bit. I know we don't know, but I'm going to ask you anyway because I keep doing that. What do you think Rishi Sunak is going to do about HS2?
Well, the word inside government is that he's made up his mind, at least as far as the key bit between Birmingham and Manchester is concerned, that he's going to basically can that. There's still apparently a bit of an open question about whether the line from Birmingham down to London will eventually make it into Euston Station or whether it will terminate as the current plan is at Old Oak Common, an old railway yard out in the suburbs of West London. But people say the decision's been taken. I mean, the politics of this look absolutely dreadful. And the longer he waits before announcing this, the more political damage he's going to sustain. We saw in the Times today, George Osborne and Michael Heseltine condemning in the strongest possible terms the idea of killing the leg between Birmingham and Manchester. And I just personally find it incredibly depressing. I was down in Devon this weekend looking across the excess street to the line that Brunel built down to Cornwall, which goes, you've probably been on that train, John, where it goes along the coast, through tunnels, right along the seafront, through some of the most inhospitable terrain for railway building. He built that 175 years ago. Victorians in top hats going around on horseback. The idea that 175 years later, we are incapable of building a high-speed line between our major cities in this country, when every other country in Europe's doing it, the Spanish, the Italians, the French, the Germans, the Chinese knock them out in every 5 years. I mean, it's a national humiliation.
I think I have been on that train actually. It's quite an experience, with the vapor pouring out of the smokestack. I even got to ride on the footplate for a while and shovel coal into the furnace. As I say, I like reverting to the age of 8 every now and again. But you hear, George, you reckon the word is that he's going to just put a halt to Birmingham to Manchester, not delay it by 7 years as was suggested. Just end it.
Well, I mean, there are different accounts of that, and you're right that some people are saying that he might decide to halt it for 7 years. Other people in government say that's not Rishi Sunak's style. He wants to be seen as this decisive leader. And what's the advantage of fudging it? You don't get you get the worst of all worlds in that respect. I mean, why would you delay it and then say you're going to build it in seven years later, when all the engineering has to be put on ice, staff have to be laid off? I mean, who really believes that it will be revived after 7 years to gain what? I mean, the British government can afford to pay for this railway. The idea that, we need to save up our money for 7 years to actually get enough money to build it and then build it 7 years later. I mean, it's nonsense. Either you're going to do it or not. And I think a delay is probably from a political point of view as well as from an engineering point of view, the worst of all worlds. My word.
I mean, he better put on his tin hat, Kate, and ready for for Heseltine and for Osborne and for the Northern Powerhouse lot and for various mayors to circle overhead dropping verbal bombs, because that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, it's already happening. And I think we were talking about this earlier, weren't we, that the Prime Minister would have expected that this decision would cause some controversy. I think the big question now, though, is, if, as George says, the Prime Minister has decided, and I think, there are conflicting noises tonight inside government about whether or not that decision has been made or whether we will even find out this week at all. The suggestion initially was that we would. I wonder whether there is a moment of pause over the fact that there is now a link that's been made between this leg of HS2, Birmingham to Manchester, and the future of Northern Powerhouse Rail, which is in the Conservative Party's 2019 manifesto. It's absolutely crucial to lots of people in the constituencies that the Tories need to retain for the next general election, and was a promise that was much, repeated often over and over again by politicians over the last couple of years, that levelling up was all about connecting those towns and cities. Now, we know that the Prime Minister recognises the importance of towns. It's going to be central, we hear, to their election strategy going forward. The idea that those are where votes could be won for the Conservative Party. I mean, it would be a fundamental problem for lots of people in those northern and Midlands towns if the government were to can this completely and therefore put in jeopardy the Northern Powerhouse Rail, which has been promised. I think that's the biggest political problem to overcome, and it's why I can see an argument for postponement because it doesn't take it fully off the table. It's a bit like what they've done with Euston. Yes, there is a cost to doing that, but renegotiating the cost of the station there, asking planners to go back to the drawing board, it's not done. But, it could be, I suppose, this week, but it's not done. It's just renegotiated is slightly preferable to completely canning it.
But it's kicking the can two general elections into the future, not just down the road into the next county, across the border, somewhere into the North Sea. The Prime Minister would, though, George, at least presentationally, have to come up with something pretty convincing by way of alternative investment in rail links across the Pennines, east to west and so on, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I think that's certainly what people expect him to do, to announce improvements to the so-called Northern Powerhouse rail line, improve those connections between Liverpool and Hull through Manchester and Leeds across the Pennine. So, yes, I'm sure there'll be that. I'm sure he could also announce he's spending money that would have been spent on HS2 on tram routes in northern cities. I think Leeds has got plans for a tram network as well. So you can see he could identify money for a whole load of other projects, which is all well and good, but I also think there's a political argument here, which I'm no doubt people in Number 10 think he can come up with some kind of sort of trap for Labour here, where basically he says we're taking money from HS2, giving to all these other projects. What would you do, Labour? Would you stick with HS2? And if you do stick with HS2, how do you find the money for the other projects? So there's the old tax argument that he's trying to push them into. Yeah. But I'll come back to the main point, which is that every other country in Europe has linked its major cities by high-speed rail. The West Coast Main Line is the most heavily used railway in Europe, we're told. And this is about capacity and about modernising Britain. And the broader thing, I think, and the thing that I think may be giving Rishi Sunak some cause for thought, is this idea that, it puts a big flag up over Britain saying that this country is unable to deliver on its flagship infrastructure projects. And a load of people make investments in this country based on the promises governments make about improving the country's infrastructure. Yeah,
you can bet your bottom dollar though. That's where we go from here when we get the announcement. Labour, what are you going to do? That's going to be the challenge. And Kate, Labour, they've been doing the familiar trick now of sort of digging in at the crease and playing the deadest possible bat, making Jeff Boycott look like Ben Stokes. They've got to come up with an answer.
They do. Last week, the answer was, though, that we will continue HS2 as it's planned now. So they will commit to Birmingham to Manchester. It's different if the government does decide to scrap that, because, of course, if a Labour government did come in further down the line, maybe in a year or so's time, to then get that started again would have a cost implication attached to it. So it would mean that Labour would be forced into a position where the cost would be higher than even they expected it to be, given where we know things are at the moment. And I think that is a problem. There is a bigger problem, though, when George is kind of highlighting it there. If the UK doesn't invest in HS2 as has been proposed, those plans are what Network Rail have based their own plans on in the years to come in terms of where they can increase capacity, particularly freight, because freight uses the same rails as everything else. And at the moment, we are hitting capacity on some of these lines. If you don't re-upgrade and if you don't do the work that HS2 was sort of proposing to do, even with tinkering around, even with tram networks, even with upgrades to existing rail lines, it won't be enough to deal with the capacity issue that we currently have. And I think that's one of the problems, that if there is a political decision to scrap this, navigating that and explaining it to the public when all of these voices are against you already will be quite difficult, I think.
Last thought on this, George. I wonder how this plays if the Prime Minister goes down this route that we're discussing as a distinct possibility here. I wonder how it plays with the public. Public opinion, according to an opinion poll, the last one that I saw on this, was very split. There were 26% who said they neither supported nor opposed HS2. 18% support, 16% opposed, so pretty evenly balanced. I wonder, I'm not quite convinced as of now, George, that this is going to be a game changer at all.
No, this will have been polled, and I'm sure part of this proposal will include Rishi Sunak making announcements in favour of motorists, having a strategy for motorists. And we got a flavour of that last week, didn't we, with the delay in the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars to give motorists a bit more time to upgrade their cars. So I think his calculation is that, and I think he said it himself, that a large part of the country never use trains. They use cars, they might use buses and trams. And so I think that's how he will try to frame it, that he's this is a prestige elite project, doesn't really make much difference for the ordinary lives of people. I think the thing about high-speed rail, and you see this in other countries around the world, is it's very hard to sort of work out exactly how the long-term economic effects of building those lines are going to play out. I mean, I sort of know the French city of Lille quite well in northern France, and that's a city which was in heavy industrial decline, seemed to be going nowhere. The high-speed rail line went through it, and the city was reinvented. And you get a whole load of network effects that people don't necessarily think about. People who can commute between Lille and Paris very easily. Whole sort of ecosystem of the local economy changes, and there are things that you will miss out on, I think, if this line is never built.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe we'll get the announcement very, very soon, and if we don't, well, it makes Manchester all the more interesting. Let's part of the one there just for the moment. Then you're listening to Pienaar and Friends with McCann and George Parker in association with Audi. Designed around your business. Just search Audi Fleets.
Times Radio Breakfast with Asma Mir and Stig Abel.
There are other breakfast programmes apparently, but you don't want to be listening to them. They're not worth your time. We're worth your time. Join us, Stig Abel and Asma Mir, for a much more enjoyable breakfast from 6 o'clock.
And our Tuesday Leaders panel is here at 9. William Hague and Kezia Dugdale, no less, will give us their take on the day's news.
Times Radio Breakfast with Asma Mir and Stig Abel. Tomorrow morning from 6 on Times Radio.
I'll be the level head in churning seas.
And you there, wonder what you're thinking. Send me a text, send me a tweet, and let us know. Let's talk about the Met. Let's talk about firearms. Army officers that were brought in to support or put on standby to support the Met Police after hundreds of officers downed their weapons have been told to stand down today. Around 300 officers handed in their guns when an unnamed colleague was charged with the murder of Chris Kabar, who was an unarmed black man. The Met says it no longer needs help offered by the Ministry of Defence, and earlier I spoke to Lord MacDonald, Director of Public Prosecutions between 2003 and 2008, and he said armed officers should not have intervened in the case in this manner.
But the fact is that the police obviously can't have a veto over prosecution decisions to charge police officers. And if what they intended to convey by handing in their guns was that police officers should never be charged, well, that's not something which any prosecutor or any justice system could ever accept. I mean, these decisions are given to the statutory prosecutor. I've no doubt this one was decided at the very highest levels, probably approved by the Director of Public Prosecutions himself because of its sensitivity. So it's gone through the process. It's now with the courts. It's up to the courts to decide whether this charge is rightly brought or not. And I don't think that individual police officers, fine men and women as they may be, should be involving themselves in this way.
Well, George Parker, so there's a former DPP expressing himself, I know, judiciously, but pretty clearly and rather strongly. He felt the police had no business taking action in this way. What do you think?
Yeah, I've some sympathy with that view. I mean, this is obviously a legally very sensitive case. The fact that an officer has been charged with murder of Chris Kaba, and you know that people have sort of stepped out almost one step ahead of the legal process, and are starting to say that the police need protections from prosecution in this kind. We don't know, and we won't know until this case goes to court, what exactly the circumstances were, and indeed whether the police are justified in feeling concerned about this. So,
we should say just at the outset, if I may interrupt you just for a second, you know, we're speaking now without prejudice to a case that may or may not arise in the future. A man has been charged with murder, and we cannot and will not say anything to prejudice those proceedings. But the broader questions of principle do hang in the air here. we saw officers taking what was, in effect, a form of industrial action and laying down the weapons that it was part of their duty to carry for the protection of the public. And Lord MacDonald thought that was inappropriate on principle. And you agree with that, George?
I do agree with them on principle. I think it's regrettable that we got to a situation where the army were put on standby to cover for those police officers. And I think the whole thing. I'm glad to see that Metropolitan Police hasn't had to use the army, as it turned out, and they've got enough people to cover. But it did seem to me to be an excessive reaction.
What do you think, Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a look. I think there's a sense inside Number 10 that the desire with this review is to give those officers who have to make split-second decisions, based on training, but also instinct. I think, which is where the difficulties are here, is to give them more clarity on what can and can't be sort of acceptable, what isn't going to be protected, so that they can make those decisions in a better way. And I think, the Home Secretary has clearly decided that there is something here that is not clear. Some circumstances where it is not entirely clear what officers should do in each situation. Now, the difficulty that you've heard today on a human level from some officers is that because of the nature of the job, because it is based on a split-second decision, the last thing you want is hesitation. You do not want to be working with people in situations where, it could be life or death. For somebody next to you to hesitate if it means that you are then put at risk. Now, it's the same for the general public. The principle is the same for everybody, police, general public, everybody else. But it's really important that there is complete clarity. And I think what you can take from Number 10 in the Home Office is that they feel that somewhere there isn't. And that's what they want to try and clear up.
Yeah, I mean, Ken MacDonald, knows more about these questions than most of us. Took the view that we have clarity at the moment. I mean, by definition, if an officer, again, I'm not talking about any particular case here, but an officer draws a weapon and fires it, it is by definition in extreme circumstances. And it can only be because the officer judged that to draw and fire a weapon is necessary to protect his own welfare, his own life, or that of another person, which is as clear a case as you could have. And I guess the argument then goes that you should always have officers accountable against the possibility of negligence or worse, malice. And that cannot change.
No, and I think, this question of accountability is actually something that has been running as a thread through all of our conversations about the Metropolitan Police now for probably over a year, maybe 2 years, 3 years. And we've seen huge numbers of Met Police expelled from the force, increasing numbers under investigation for their own behaviour. I think the Met recognises that it does have a problem. I think the reaction of some of these officers here is in part reaction to that, actually, that they feel that they've spent quite a long time under public pressure and scrutiny. Maybe they feel unfairly in some ways, that they've been tarred with the same brush as their Metropolitan Police colleagues who have had to leave the force for completely separate reasons, and that they are not used to not having the support of the public when it comes to doing such a difficult and dangerous job. And that actually, it's a volunteer position. You do train for it, but it's a position on top of your existing role. And there is a prestige attached to it, and there is a reputational element that many officers like. But it is also a huge responsibility that lots of people would not want to carry out. And I think the balance here has got out of kilter for them, certainly, and for the general public too, in terms of that accountability and fairness and who is actually doing the right thing here.
And given, let's again underline that point, that given that using a firearm can only be done to protect your own life or that of someone else, it is by definition about as extreme a situation as you could have and about as high pressure a situation. No doubt last second choices have to be made on pretty much every occasion. Look, George, just a word on the Home Secretary, and forgive me for being repetitive about this, again, without prejudice to a case which may be, running through the pipeline at the moment. In principle, for the Home Secretary to speak out as she did this weekend and suggest the guidelines needed to be looked at. Well, Lord MacDonald thought that was entirely inappropriate. What did you think?
Well, I say, we've got to be careful about how we talk about this case and the fact that charges have been made. Yeah. Well, that's what I was trying to get out at the outset, that she seemed to be jumping one step ahead of the legal process and concluding as a result of this particular case there needs to be a review. Look, I think there is a case for reviews in politics and in all walks of life. When tempers are fraying and emotions are high for obvious reasons, and you end up with quite a worrying situation in London this weekend with armed officers laying down their weapons and possibly the army coming in, I think there is actually a case for Suella Braverman ordering a review just to let tensions calm down a bit and to do a thorough review of it. But I do share some of Ken McDonald's concerns that maybe she was just going a little bit too far.
All right. Thanks for your thoughts on all of that. Now, in a moment, after the news, we can hear from Kate Borsay, who will be joining us, telling us about her show, which kicks off at 8 o'clock, right after Pienaar and Friends. And then just after that, I want to look at what's going on in America. Some interesting opinion polling reported over the weekend, giving Donald Trump whacking great leads over Joe Biden, should it come to a head-to-head between the two of them. And signs are it may well and very likely will come to exactly that. Let's look at that and where we are in the turbulent up and downs of American politics just at the moment after the news. Now it's 7:31 here on Pienaar and Friends. So let's get the latest news with Jeremy Lieben.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thanks, John. Good evening. A number of sexual offence claims have been made to the Metropolitan Police following the Times and Channel 4 investigation into Russell Brand. Allegations relate to both London and elsewhere in the country. He's not earning money from YouTube at the moment after it pulled his ads, and a senior MP asked other platforms if they'd do the same. The comedian denies all allegations against him and, speaking on social media platform Rumble, claims to be the victim of a conspiracy.
An apparent concerted effort by legacy media and now the state and big tech to silence independent media voices. Obviously, it's difficult for me to be entirely objective given the events of the last week.
The number of appointments rescheduled or cancelled because of strike action in England has now exceeded 1 million. Figures suggest almost 130,000 were affected last week alone. People coming in and out of Gatwick Airport this week are being warned of potential disruption. Takeoffs and landings are being limited to 800 a day until Sunday because of staff sickness in air traffic control, meaning more than 100 flights are cancelled. Lucy Letby will face a retrial on a charge of attempting to murder a baby. The 33-year-old former nurse was found guilty last month of murdering 7 babies and trying to kill 6 others at a hospital in Chester. And Lib Dem leader Sir Ed Davey has suggested he would be prepared to do a post-election deal with Labour. He's been speaking at the party's annual conference about removing the Tories from power. And for a news bulletin when you want it, search for The Times News Briefing on any podcast platform.
This is Times Radio.
What gives you more while you're holding less?
A mini dumbbell. More gain, less pain?
No, it's my new Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 5. It unfolds and stands upright to take hands-free pics.
Useful. Want to snap these guns?
Buy the Galaxy Z Flip 5 from EE by 28th of September and claim a Galaxy Chromebook Go worth £299 on us. Plus, save up to £576 when you trade in your old Samsung in any condition. Claim on website within 30 days of purchase. Trade-in offer ends 30th of September. Max trade-in on...
And here on Pienaar and Friends this evening, Kate McCann, our very own political editor, and George Parker, the FT's very own political editor. And now we're joined by Kate, our very own Kate Borsay. Hello, Kate.
I've just been told we're broadcasting live to YouTube.
We are. We're on YouTube Live as I speak. I'm looking at a picture. There you are. There's your face. There we go.
I'm going to have to stop pulling silly faces, aren't I? No very, very serious
you look great,
I'm going to have to click into TV mode. Yeah. I'm not worried about what I look like. I'm worried about the faces that I'm going to pull.
Facial expressions is a problem.
Yeah. We've almost been used to so much freedom.
I haven't noticed you gurning during the during your programme all night.
Because
she doesn't when you're not looking, that's why.
Also, I'm going to be careful about what I eat, how much I drink, what I wear. Anyway,
this flask
we live in a visual world.
Jack Daniels, would you
do
like
not admit that live on air? Well, we are going to be talking about drinking actually in the show this evening. But first, of course, we'll discuss HS2 with Jason McCartney, the Conservative MP for Colne Valley and West Yorkshire. We'll talk about the fact that we are a great railway nation. We seem to have completely lost our sense, though, when it comes to building anything new. So we'll do that. We'll also touch on the Gatwick story as well, air traffic control issues, COVID, and staff shortages to blame there. We've got Maggie Alfonsi with us, who is just an absolute rugby legend, basically part of that 2014 World Cup winning side, and she'll be talking to us more, actually, about where the legacy is now. A couple of different stories for you.
one that will feature is that bar staff are being told to stop egging on binge drinkers. So there's some new guidance out, free of charge guidance to anyone who works in a bar. And they're being encouraged to stop using phrases like "same again" and "is that a double?"
Yeah.
Even if it promotes sales. So we're going to talk about that and just how difficult. Well, I mean, how much is this nanny statism? Do we need to ask our bar staff to take a look at us? I mean, I wouldn't dare say that to you, John. I just think, well, he's obviously got all his faculties about him.
Who's issued this guidance?
Huh?
Who has issued this guidance?
It is the International Alliance for Responsible Drinking, shortened to IARD.
I actually saw a bizarre, curious enough, a documentary about Wetherspoons.
Mm-hmm.
And they, on that programme, claimed they had a sales policy across their bar staff to do exactly that. So when you're inviting your customer to tell them what you want to drink, you say, so would you like a large one? Or would you go with a small one? And the idea of that, you say large one first. Nobody says, no, I'll go with the small one. You go with the first thing.
And also, how many times, I mean, on Saturday night, I said, I think I have a small glass. It was right at the end of the night. And the bar staff member looked at me and went, really? Do you really want a small one? And I was like... No, I'm such a pushover. I was like, oh, no, go on, I'll have a large one then. You just need, especially if you've had a couple of glasses already, you really don't need much encouragement, do you?
Yeah, the sort of thing you might say if someone's in your house. But if you're you're selling it to them, for goodness sake.
No one leaves my house sober.
I was going to say, John, remind me to book a taxi next time I come over to your house. Not cycling back from yours.
So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then an extraordinary investigation by The Times. This is David Brown, who is a brilliant Times chief reporter. And this is regarding the boss of AFC Wimbledon, a club that's really highly regarded when it comes to level playing field. They are part of the Her Game 2 campaign. So it's all about equality across the sexes. It's all about stamping out discrimination, misogyny, and they've all signed up to this, including this particular boss, who basically was secretly recorded absolutely laying into the female executive at his club, who was partly responsible for bringing about inclusive policies. And when I say laying in, I mean
really bad.
Vile language,
yeah, it's bad.
which The Times has got up on its website right now, thetimes.co.uk. We've got a bit of that audio, and it's awful, and it raises questions about whether actually football is either as bad as we think it is in that respect, or it's signing up to lots of great policies, lots of inclusion policies, lots of forward-thinking campaigns, whereas actually behind the scenes, not much has changed. I think some people are trying to provoke change, but there are other, I'll call them dinosaurs, call them whatever you want within the game, who are not on board and are almost gloating about not being on board. Yeah. So there's a real concern. As I say, AFC Wimbledon's a pretty forward-thinking club, so it's disappointing, but it does sort of cast a spotlight really on where we are with that.
Well, you'd like to think that sort of way of going on, which no doubt was a familiar feature of the game, not a few years ago, more than just a few years ago. You think that attitudes have changed, and I, for one, would have guessed that they had, and I still would guess that they had, but there were going to be enclaves of the old days, here and there, maybe in quite a lot of places.
Yeah, I went to our local football club, probably fairly local to you as well, Kate, about 5 years ago, and I wasn't allowed in the chairman's room because it was men only. And this was a game where they'd invited lots of kind of female stakeholders within the game, journalists, etc. I'm pretty sure the policy's changed now, but the club were really embarrassed about it. I'm so sorry, but you can't actually go in there because that is by policy of the club, men only. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
It's incredible, really.
Yeah. Well, they might be embarrassed. It sounds like a good show, really good show.
Cheers.
Always is. Kate Borsay coming up at 8 o'clock. Now, let's talk about American politics. What is going on over there? You can ask that question any given hour of any given day, and the answer is always going to be interesting. It certainly is now, because Donald Trump, he seems to have, in one recent poll over the weekend, a commanding double-digit lead over Joe Biden before next year's election. It's an ABC News Washington Post poll, and it put Trump, the front runner, of course, for the Republican nomination, 10 points ahead of Joe Biden in a head-to-head, which is what a lot of people really expect the next election to be. The numbers suggest a clear win for the former president rather than a repeat of 2020, when, of course, it was much closer. What do you think about this, Kate? It's a huge potential upheaval coming over the horizon. The likelihood, more than just likely, that Trump will be the nominee for the Republican Party. Various wild cards in the pack. prosecutions and all the rest of it. But, Biden versus Trump, it looks on most calculations really, really close, or maybe on this poll in Trump's favour. It's got a lot of people thinking and quite a few worrying.
Yeah, it has, although I think it's worth saying that it's also had a fair share of critics of this poll, suggesting it's an outlier, that it doesn't conform to any of the other polls.
The Post wrote that it was an outlier.
Yeah, exactly, and questioning the kind of, the substance behind this poll and why it would show such a rogue result, if you like. But, let's step back from the poll itself and let's think about Donald Trump. I mean, I think President Biden does have an issue here. There's been questions about his age, about his ability to do his job, about whether or not he really is competent. And although the two men aren't actually that different in age, really when it comes down to it, and particularly when you reference politics in this country, I think there is a sense, and a growing one, of President Biden just not being necessarily as on top of things as people maybe would like, and that presents a problem. And, there have always been analysts who've suggested that Donald Trump could well be quite popular, a second time around, as hard as we may find that to believe here in this country.
And the polls say that if it was up to, I guess, the weight of American opinion, they'd have neither of them. But as it stands, they're going to have both of them up against each other. I mean, quick word with you, George. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, it's going to be such a momentous election, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, we've discussed this before, and the possibility this election in the United States could be happening at the same time as the election in the UK, and both will be dramatic. But the American one, I think most of us would agree, will grip the world's attention in a way that few elections will have done, if it's indeed Trump versus Biden. As Kate was saying, this poll, the Washington Post ABC poll, is the second outlier poll which they've produced, and pollsters are questioning the accuracy of this and suggesting that actually most polls show the two of them neck and neck. But I mean, leaving that aside, it's plainly going to be much closer than anyone on this side of the Atlantic could possibly countenance, between an incumbent president versus someone who's facing multiple criminal charges. But it's plainly going to be close, and the fact that you've got these polls putting Trump ahead will just feed the momentum that he's gained from these various cases being brought against him by the anti-Trump the liberal judicial establishment in the United States.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, this is a perfect moment to get a really right up-to-date expert analysis of what's going on in those American polls. So let's welcome Dritten Nisho, Chief Executive and lead pollster of Harris X, the polling company. Hello, Dritten.
Hello, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here, Dritten. So give me your latest thinking on the polls over there. How do you read them, especially in the light of these, quite startling polls over the weekend?
So Joe Biden had a bad week last week. He was targeted with an impeachment inquiry by Republicans in Congress. His son was indicted by the special counsel, and he also neglected to show up in any of the 9/11 memorial places as he was coming back from Asia, which was really an unforced error that did not go unnoticed with the American public. So all this, in addition to the fact that there's real concerns about his age, this came together and was picked up by a series of polls that essentially showed the trends switching from a statistical tie between Biden and Trump, which is where they were for most of August in polling, to several polls now showing Trump to be ahead of Biden. Now, is Trump 10 points ahead of Biden? No. And the Washington Post ABC poll, by their own acknowledgement, was an outlier. There were some oddities in the poll, like Trump winning the youth vote, the 18 to 29-year-old vote, by a full 20 points, and also winning minorities by 42 points, which are not in line with what the other polls are showing. Nevertheless, Trump is an incredibly competitive candidate. And what's unique about this potential matchup in American politics is that essentially you have two incumbent presidents running against one another, which hasn't happened for a very long time in American politics. And what's really concerning for Biden is his approval numbers compared to the approval numbers for Trump. In that Washington Post ABC poll, they asked what is your approval of the job that former President Trump did? And 48% that they said that they approved of him, which is higher than when he left office. And Biden's own approval had collapsed to the high 30s. So that's not a good augur, right? And the Biden team has to do something to start changing the trend and the inclination. But by and large, the truth is somewhere closer to, a statistical tie, right?
Right.
And it was Trump plus a few points, sometimes Biden plus a few points another time.
Right. I mean, when you look at how, through a lens of conventional political analysis, when you look at these two men, they are so far apart in every conceivable way, apart from, I guess, their age. It's hard to imagine there is such a thing as a floating voter in America when you look at both of those two possibilities. To the extent that there is a floating voter, the independents who aren't registered to either the Democrats or the Republican Party, or who are capable of being won over from one side to the other, Britain, how big is that constituency? How many Americans are there? How many of those that hold the key to the White House, essentially, between them?
So independents in the United States are roughly around 40% of the electorate. And the current system forces a choice on independents, either the presumptive nominee of the Democrats or the presumptive nominee of the Republicans, or the eventual nominees. The center is quite large in the United States. And this is why you see some initiatives like the No Labels initiative picking up a lot of steam right now. And their whole idea is that they want to list a potential unity ticket, a Republican and a Democrat, independent-minded Democrat and independent-minded Republican, in all 50 states. So that if such a ticket emerges that vouches for the center, voters have the ability to vote for it and have the ability to vote for a third choice. And what we see consistently in the polling is that 70% of Americans, 70, are not happy with a presumptive matchup, same as it was the last time around, meaning Biden versus Trump, Trump versus Biden. They think that the country can do better. They want fresher choices, but the parties are hoisting that choice upon them. And it's an interesting moment in American politics, because either you could see the emergence of a very strong third party ticket, stronger even than Ross Perot was in 1992, or you might potentially have an election that is a very low turnout election because voters are dissatisfied with the choices that are being offered to them.
Yeah, given those variables, I'm not even going to ask you, where your money is, because it is simply not callable at this point. From what we have seen, Driss, last question on this, I'm going to get Kate and George's thoughts on, well, what are we thinking here? What are our leaders, our government ministers and senior opposition figures thinking about the possibility of the outcome of the American election? But let me ask you finally, Driss, what's your sense from the data that you've seen and your own instincts on how America will move if and when Donald Trump is in the dock facing all those multiple charges, criminal charges in various courts in different jurisdictions, and even the possibility of a jail term? How will that affect the polls, do you think?
It's unsure, right? Every time an indictment has come out against Trump, there's been a rally around the leader effect within the Republican base. So Republican voters seem to be very committed to picking Trump as their nominee. And you have historically examples of presidential nominees who have collected millions of votes even whilst being in jail. There's a precedent in the 1920s when, at that time, the socialist or communist candidate was put in jail due to charges and collected over 1 million votes. So it's an unprecedented situation, and you don't quite know what will happen once those trials start, and whether or not Republican voters will make a pragmatic choice and start peeling off from Trump and supporting someone like, let's say, Nikki Haley, who consistently does better than Biden in head-to-head matchups in polling, and is a very strong general election candidate, but one that would have trouble breaking through the Republican Party primary process. So you don't know whether Republicans voters are going to go pragmatically with someone like Haley or whether they'll stick to their flag bearer, which at this stage is Donald Trump, and a full 60% of Republican primary voters support him now over the other candidate.
Okay, question marks, but very, very, very absorbing question marks. Written in the show at Harris X. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're going to talk on in a moment about, well, what do our politicians make of all of these extraordinary possibilities? Kate McCann, George Parker here with me on Pienaar and Friends. And Kate, of course, is going to be with us at 8 o'clock, so do stick around. You're listening to Pienaar and Friends in association with Audi and the business of progress. Just search Audi Fleet.
Matt Chorley, tomorrow morning from 10 on Times Radio.
And we're discussing the next American election coming up next November 2024. At the moment, it looks like Trump versus Biden. Extraordinary ramifications were that election to result in a new president, or the old president back in the White House, Donald Trump. George Parker, Kate McCann here with me on Pienaar and Friends. George, have you had many conversations about this with British government ministers? Does it come up much? Because it's got to be on a lot of people's minds.
To be honest, less so with British government ministers and more with the Labour Party leadership, who obviously hope to be in power around about the same time as the American election takes place next November. And on the Labour side, certainly there's this grandiose talk about having a progressive moment. The idea of Keir Starmer being elected in London, Joe Biden being elected in Washington, sort of the common economic policy they have together, this idea of securonomics, the government intervening to try to promote the transition to a green economy, industrial policy and all that sort of stuff. It's all meeting in minds. There's an awful lot of work going on behind the scenes between Joe Biden's people and Keir Starmer's people. In fact, when I was over in Washington with Rishi Sunak earlier in the year, while he was meeting Joe Biden, Keir Starmer's officials were round the back of in the West Wing having talks with Democratic officials about how to win the election and how to basically boot Rishi Sunak out of office. So the links are very, very tight between Labour and the Democrats. And from the Labour point of view, obviously, if it's not a progressive moment, if indeed it's President Trump back in the White House, then life becomes an awful lot more complicated.
Yeah.
And to be fair, it doesn't become an awful lot simpler if you're Rishi Sunak either. If Rishi Sunak was in the next election, the whole architecture of US-UK relations will be thrown up in the air. Not least, of course, the question of what Donald Trump would do with the war in Ukraine.
As you say, challenge whoever wins the next election. Labour very openly aligned with the Democratic Party, the Conservative side, well, spiritually, historically, with the Republican side, although that line's been blurred over recent years. And with Donald Trump as leader of the Republican Party, well, more than blurred, Kate, wasn't it? Boris Johnson was in the happy, if happy is the word, in the happy position of being in favour with Donald Trump, but we know now, because it's all been chronicled, he did not want to see Donald Trump hanging around in the White House for a moment longer than necessary. And for Rishi Sunak, with all the problems we're talking about here and the potential challenges, NATO, Western security, the Western alliance, just dealings with Washington. They're not going to say it, but every finger must be crossed against a Trump win in Sunak's Downing Street.
Yeah, look, I don't think it would be welcomed by either Rishi Sunak or Sir Keir Starmer. But what we've got to remember is that President Biden hasn't exactly pursued policies which have been welcomed by the UK government here either. I mean, there have been difficulties in trying to work with some of the things that President Biden has been doing, particularly on the economy and green jobs, as we know. And, you know, as George says, that's something that the Labour Party has talked of, and there's a much kind of closer alignment there. But I don't think American presidents are ever really necessarily easy for UK prime ministers, because there's always this tension over, you know, the special relationship and how accommodating is America going to be to the UK. And of course, remember, there's no trade deal and there's no prospect of a trade deal. George and I were both on the trip to Washington recently with Rishi Sunak, and that was one of the first things out of his mouth on the plane over. We're not seeking a trade deal.
Sure. He's
got to say that because he knows it's not going to happen.
And that's been the case for a very long time.
It has. And so I think really you can see that neither Biden or Trump would be necessarily particularly accommodating. But I think the war in Ukraine will be one of the biggest flashpoints if it was a Donald Trump presidency, because I think it is much more uncertain, the direction of travel there. And there are already some fairly big concerns about whether Ukraine is going to get the continued support of all Western allies as it has at the moment. It's something that Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, is very aware of. Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister too, both very aware that things could slip. And I think that will be something that will become a primary focus of that election campaign and also the one here in the UK.
And a certain amount of certainty about this. I mean, Joe Biden, if he's re-elected, will carry on where he left off with support for Ukraine, as far as he can get that through Congress after the election. We don't know how that's going to play out on Capitol Hill either. If Donald Trump is there, he's on record 100 times over now saying he will seek a very, very rapid end to the war, and that would mean accommodation, or he would push Ukraine towards accommodation with Vladimir Putin. Yeah. And that would be a huge challenge in terms of supply to Ukraine, which would tip the balance of what that country needs to manage its defence against Russia. And also a bigger question of NATO. I mean, you've heard people like John Bolton arguing in this studio and many other places that second-term President Trump would want America out of NATO. Now, that's a challenge, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a huge challenge and a shake-up to international world order. Although, you know, some would say not overdue, that there have been some questions about how well things have been performing on that front over the last couple of months, maybe years anyway. It's worth just saying that some of the suggestion is that if it was Biden versus Trump again, and there was voter apathy, which many expect that there would be, it could see Trump actually become more successful because of that, because he has such a strong base, whereas Biden may not necessarily motivate enough people to get out to vote, which, I mean, there is a route in which this is a very real prospect of a Donald Trump back in the White House. I mean, it's not pie in the sky, I think.
George, I mean, I've been looking at commentators on social media just again today saying the West, is it mentally prepared for what may happen next November?
Well, I mean, as Kate was just describing there, it would be a real fracturing of the Western alliance if Trump gets back in. You know, whether he does or doesn't pull out of NATO, plainly the strains in NATO are going to be visible. And all the efforts that have been made, including by Rishi Sunak actually, to make sure that America is bound back into the Western family, this AI, Artificial Intelligence Summit, which Rishi Sunak's hosting in November, that the Americans have been cooperating with, you know, the AUKUS Defence Pact, you know, all these attempts to sort of bind the West together, you know, especially with the rise of China, not to mention Russia, of course. If that's fractured, I mean, it's a very dangerous moment for the West.
You could say that again, and we're going to be talking about it again. You can bet on that with even greater certainty. Thank you to Kate. Thank you to George. Sandra Glab, our producer. James Welly, our technical operator. Kate's up next. This is Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thanks, John. Have a great evening. There we go, broadcasting live via YouTube. I've learnt something new today, and we'll be furnishing you with plenty of delicious stories as well to get your heads around. We'll talk about HS2 and the latest with Gatwick, as well as COVID and staffing issues threaten to pull plenty of flights. I will also speak to the England World Cup